evening, everyone. The Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and the TERI School of Advanced Studies, in collaboration with German Advisory Council on Global Change, WiseEuropa, the Warsaw Institute of Economic and European Studies Foundation, and Ecological Institute is organizing the UNFCCC side event today, titled Beyond Climate Neutrality, Using LTS to Chart an Equitable Path for a Resilient Planet. Using long-term strategies on equity considerations are crucial to raising ambition in short-term climate policy, finance, and to reach climate stabilization. Through this official event, we discuss their event in sustainability, governance, core topics such as energy and transport, ecosystem stewardship, CO2 removals, and adaptation. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Vibha Dhawan, Director General TERI, for the welcome remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anuradha. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants of this conference. On behalf of the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI School of Advanced Studies, German Advisory Council on Global Change, the Warsaw Institute for Economic and European Studies Foundation, and Ecological Institute, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all the esteemed speakers, colleagues, and participants joining this event titled Beyond Climate Neutrality, Using LTS to Charter an Equitable Path for a Resilient Planet. Global collaborations and strong coalitions are important to mobilize action to address climate change impacts. But the real arena for climate action is at the national and sub-national levels, as well as in business and industry. Climate action should be understood in not just sectoral terms, but also in cross-sectoral aspects, including in areas of finance, as well as science, technology, and innovation. Keeping this in mind, the Energy and Resources Institute, that's TERI, has put together this knowledge document, COP26 Charter of Actions, as an effort to rally for an equitable and ambitious global climate agenda. I'm happy to welcome you all to the launch of this very important document. Issues emanating from the COP26 discussions and the Charter would culminate in a review at a plenary session at the World Sustainable Development Summit 2022, which would assess the efforts of international climate negotiations in securing a sustainable future and deliberate on future actions. The Charter will examine the themes of equality, green finance, nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience, energy, clean transport, and business action. Long-term low-emission development strategies, LTS, as under section Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement, can be a key instrument to implementing the Paris Agreement if equity considerations are taken into account. To reach global climate stabilization, it is crucial that countries develop long-term visions, goals, and strategic guidelines for climate policy embedded in a wider sustainability agenda. This will be the basis of the panel discussion, which is to follow the launch of the Charter. I'm very happy to welcome distinguished speakers from our partner organizations to present their findings. I also look forward to an insightful discussions from the invited external speakers as well. Once again, I welcome you all to what promises to be a stellar conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I now invite Mr. R.P. Gupta, Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, to deliver the keynote address and launch the Charter. We will first launch the Charter, and I request Shelley, who's joining us remotely, to please share her screen. Thank you. We'll just stand.
Thank you.
Yeah, she'll speak after. So, no, it's fine. We now request you for your keynote address.
Thank you very much. And it gives me great pleasure to join you for the event on the launch of the knowledge document titled COP26 Charter of Action, prepared by TERI. I am confident this initiative will provide direction for charting a course for equitable and sustainable climate action in India and for the world. The issue for today's talk, beyond climate neutrality, using LTS to chart an equitable path for resilient climate. So when we talk about beyond climate neutrality, of course there are plenty of issues still to be worked out, negotiated and finalized before we reach climate neutrality. But even after reaching this climate neutrality, and howsoever way we define it, most probably we define it carbon neutrality by equating the sink and the emissions. The issues which are going to remain is the carbon which has been emitted into the atmosphere. What impact is it going to have on the planet, on the societies, on the nations, the people, and what differential impact it is going to have on different communities. It's very necessary that local plans and the impacts are worked out in detail as per the regions, and we start action for mitigating those impacts. The adaptation finance and adaptation action in this particular area becomes extremely important. So the discussions must start on those, and those areas which are going to have greatest of the impact, they must be helped. Those countries must be helped, those communities must be helped through a definite negotiated agenda, and the action plans along with the finance and all resources, whether technical, human, institutional, to face those issues and build their infrastructure and the economic sectors to withstand the impact of the change, which would inevitably come along with the carbon which is already there. Climate neutrality definitely does not talk about taking out the carbon which has already been put in there. We are just talking about not putting any more carbon there. So apart from the adaptation, we are going to see more and more severe events in spite of having reached carbon neutrality. They will be much more frequent, more severe. So we also have to think of the mechanism for compensating those people and the communities who are going to be impacted and who are going to suffer the losses. This will have to be an integral part of the agenda. Now, equity and climate justice would have to play a very important role in it. And it will have to be the touchstone of any global climate response. Equitable carbon and development space, that is before reaching carbon neutrality, to achieve sustainable development must be all based on the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. The principles of polluter pays to finance the adaptation and loss and damage activity beyond climate neutrality would be the guiding principle and would have to remain the touchstone of mobilizing finance, resources, and the countries and communities to be assisted. So our long-term strategies, they will have to be guided by not only mitigation, but also by climate adaptation and climate stabilization. For this measurable indicator on adaptation are needed along with support provided to developing countries to mitigate and adapt along with loss and damage. Apart from the carbon neutrality, when we talk of the environment, the pressure we put on nature through extracting various resources, they are also more or less important for environmental degradation and also cause climate change. That is where the concept of circular economy becomes extremely important. But circular economy at a very high level of consumption itself will put enormous pressure on the energy requirement. So what our Honorable Prime Minister has been saying, we have to think of a sustainable lifestyle for not only climate change, but also lessening the pressure on the environment and the nature, and to ensure that it remains at a level where nature is able to provide us those resources sustainably for our living. With that, I again thank you, the organizer of this event, and I am confident that the charter which TERI is putting out, charter of action which is being put out, would be enormously useful for countries to chart out their plan of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring words, and thank you for joining us today. I now invite Mr. R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow TERI, to take over the discussion. It starts with 3 presentations. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha, and once again, welcome to all the guests and the participants. As Secretary has rightly pointed out, the long-term development strategy does not include and should not include only mitigation, but overall climate stabilization in the interest that the larger interests of humanity are taken care of. And that includes several aspects, not just carbon emission reduction, but reducing the adverse impacts of climate change, in improving the capability of the communities and societies to adapt to climate change and be resilient to withstand the adverse impacts. They need to have adequate resources while we reduce the emissions. We also need the means of implementation, and any long-term strategy therefore cannot remain lopsided. Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement envisages a long-term strategy to be prepared by all the countries, but you must have noticed that this is under Article 4, which talks about NDCs, and NDCs are comprehensive. They are not supposed to be talking only about mitigation. Whereas adaptation is on a separate footing altogether, it is captured under Article 7. So there is a need to actually combine the 2 articles and prepare a strategy which takes care of the broad objectives of the NDCs, and at the same time making the societies resilient and enhancing their capabilities to adapt. Now, I'm really happy that these 4 institutions have come up with their own versions of how such a long-term strategy can be prepared. They will be sharing their experiences today, their visions about what a strategy should look like, what are the issues in preparing a strategy in terms of long-term goals vis-a-vis their relationship with the short-term goals. Most of the countries which have announced their NDCs, they have also, some of them have also announced a long-term goal of 2050, 2060 or 2070. But the question is, a long-term strategy in far out in the future, how should it impact the short-term goals, and in what manner can we enhance them so that they can address both needs of mitigation as well as adaptation. So without spending any more time in introducing the subject. I'll now leave it to the panelists to expand on the issue, and we have an excellent lineup from these 4 institutions. From TERISAS side, we have Shelly Kedia, who is Associate Director in TERI, and she is now running the flagship initiative of the TERI, which is World Sustainable Development Summit, and she has also been working on climate change issues. Recently, she has come out with a paper on Article 4.19. So first of all, let me invite Shelly to introduce the subject. But before that, let me point out that we have 3 presentations today, and I'll request each presenter to take about 7 to 8 minutes to do their presentation from TERISAS, from WiseEuropa, and from the German Advisory Council on global climate. And after the presentations have taken place, we will have a comment from IDRI representative here, and then we will open it up for discussion amongst the panelists and the participants. So over to you, Shelly.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. I will be sharing my screen now. I just wanted to confirm if you can see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Greetings from New Delhi, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us for this event on long-term strategies and for the launch of the COP26 Charter of Actions, a knowledge document prepared by the Energy and Resources Institute. I would like to provide a few initial inputs on the topic of today's discussion before talking about some of the messages coming from the COP26 Charter of Actions. So how long do we have? Well, we all know time is running out, and according to science, we may have less than a decade to fulfill the Paris goals. A holistic approach incorporating short, medium, and long-term measures is needed for meaningful climate actions. To fulfill the global aggregate goal of net zero by 2050 and to allow some development space for developing countries, much more is needed, especially from the developed countries who should move towards being net negative individually by 2050. Net zero is necessary but not sufficient, and climate stabilization is more important. And as the Secretary pointed in his interventions, the aspect of accumulated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which will lead to climate impacts, is the cause of concern as well. Along with that, 2030 climate targets must be revised upwards in a major way by all countries. Equity is key to effort sharing. Climate change is not a problem caused by emissions in the past few years. Climate change is a problem caused due to accumulated GHG emissions in the atmosphere since the industrialization age. United States alone accounts for 25% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. The G7 countries, and the EU 27 together account for 45% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. China accounts for 13% of the cumulative CO2 emissions, and India accounts for 3.1% of the cumulative CO2 emissions. At 1.9 tons, India's per capita emissions is less than half of the world average. The world average is 4.7 tons. India also has the lowest per capita emissions among the G7 countries. For long-term strategies, adaptation needs to be at the center stage. While it may be contended that there is a growing narrative by countries to include adaptation within their long-term strategies, however, this has not translated into any high level of integration with concrete formulation and communication in the long-term strategies submitted by countries. And in our analysis of 31 countries who had submitted their long-term strategies ahead of COP26, only 5 countries had some sort of a strong element of adaptation in their long-term strategies. And it is evident that this only shows that that the adaptation has not been given due consideration in the 31 LTS analyzed by TERI and is shown in the figure. While formulating and communication of LTS is important, developing countries should in this regard play a key role in tabling proposals for a more concrete agenda on adaptation, including on adaptation communications. Now coming to the COP26 Charter of Actions, which was launched today. As was also highlighted by our Director General, Dr. Vibhadhavan, global deliberations are important, but the real arena of climate action is at the subnational level, national level, and in the business and industry. And hence, it is important to further understand what are the sectoral implications as well as thematic implications for areas such as finance. With this rationale, the TERI prepared the COP26 Charter of Actions and examined the themes of equity, climate finance, adaptation, nature-based solutions, energy, transport, and business actions. While examining the themes in the context of India, in the process, the Charter distills messages for the global community for COP26 and beyond. The outcomes of COP26, as well as the messages from the Charter, will also be discussed at a plenary session at the World Sustainable Development Summit to be organized by TERI from 16 to 18 Feb 2022. I would like to also acknowledge all our WSDS partners who have supported us in these endeavors. Their names you can see reflected on the screen. MOEAFCC for WSDS, the British High Commission for Supporting Engagement, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, Tata Cleantech Capital, and more recently, the Rockefeller Foundation. The Charter of Actions, in a snapshot, it covers the 7 themes as highlighted, and the chapter team includes 36 authors and 9 reviewers, making it a total of 45 colleagues from TERI. Please access materials on the Charter from the links provided on the slide. Now I will be focusing more on the messages for the global community emanating from the COP26 Charter of Actions. On equity, it is imperative that the progress made by countries is assessed considering the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities well before the global stocktake that is to take place at COP28 in 2023. On India's leadership, while India has low per capita emissions, it can show normative and entrepreneurial leadership when it comes to international climate action. On climate finance, there is a need for well-defined mechanisms under the new collective quantified goal on finance. Adaptation and investment in innovation for climate stabilization and adaptation needs to be at the core of climate finance and public finance. On adaptation, a key question is whether COP26 will be an adaptation COP. This message was very strongly highlighted in the first meeting or the first high-level meeting by the Prime Minister of India. There is a need to also redefine just transitions to not just include mitigation, but also adaptation. Adaptation should be at the core of long-term strategies, as also highlighted in the beginning of the presentation. On nature-based solution, trees outside forests offer a huge potential for countries like India. In India, it has the potential of being 38% of the total carbon sink. Agroforestry and plantation programs need to be promoted on a large scale in India and in countries with similar contexts. Apart from this, ecosystem-based approaches by considering terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems need to be further enhanced along with strengthening farm and farmer resilience. Businesses can play a role in upscaling climate actions and developing disruptive technologies, especially in hard-to-abate sectors. Government, on the other hand, can play an enabling role and also promote market development of low-carbon products. On renewable energy, India has announced a recent new ambition of 500 gigawatt. Innovations for ensuring energy access through measures such as distributed renewable energy are important, along with flexibility of power systems through energy storage solutions and supply and demand measures. On sustainable mobility, low carbon transport must be equitable and available to all, and not just private vehicle owners. Institutional innovations could include a common fund for investment on low carbon transport and coordination mechanism for holistic transport planning at national and subnational levels. On sustainable consumption, short, medium, and long term strategies at the global level must focus on sustainable lifestyles and consumption. There is a need to further strengthen alignment with SDG 12, along with concrete measures such as responsible advertising, eco labels, and awareness. In conclusion, the science is clear. We cannot delay climate actions. A holistic approach for short, medium, and long-term strategies are needed. Adaptation and measurable adaptation indicators need to be at the core of long-term strategies or LTS. At the moment, this aspect is very weak even for developed countries. The present political economy realities favor mitigation over adaptation. States, countries, and governments need to ensure adequate support for adaptation and development of innovations related to adaptation. India has demonstrated entrepreneurial leadership. India will also have to take the role of a norm leader among developing countries and globally to promote shared understanding around adaptation, sustainable consumption, lifestyles, and climate justice. On this slide, I would like to acknowledge all authors and reviewers, including the chair of this session, who was part of this exercise since its inception phase. I would like to thank all of you for your attention and patience. The COP26 Charter of Actions will be publicly made available on TERI's through TERI's website. Thank you again.
Thank you, Shaili. Thank you very much. In short, what you have emphasized is that a long-term strategy must focus on climate justice, sustainable consumption and production, and a just transition to be able to actually serve the needs of climate and the world in the long term. Let me now go over to Dr. Karen Pittel, who is the chair of the German Advisory Council on Global Change and Director, Center for Energy, Climate and Exhaustible Resources in the University of Munich. Welcome, Dr. Pittel, and we would like to hear your views on how we can move beyond climate neutrality through a long-term strategy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have also some slides I want to show. Let me try to share my screen first, which is actually more complicated as I was hoping. I don't see it yet. Can only be seconds. Yeah, there it is. Can you see my presentation now? Yep, okay, great, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for also the possibility to speak today and for the opportunity to actually present you what is kind of an essence of our policy paper, Beyond Climate Neutrality. So it actually kind of meshes very well with the topic of this session. And as was already said, this paper is really calling for long-term strategies, on the one hand, pointing out why it is so necessary, but on the other hand, also identifying key requirements for these for these strategies to fulfill, but also key ingredients, key topics that they should address. So let me point out first, this Beyond Climate Neutrality is, of course, pointing to what we just heard already, that it's not enough actually to talk about climate neutrality. We have to talk about climate stabilization, and stabilization really meaning that in the long term, we will stabilize the global temperature at about 1.5 degrees above the level, the pre-industrial level, or at least well below 2 degrees. And for this, we need these long-term strategies to overcome really the bias that we still have in the NDCs, this medium or short and medium-term focus. And politics, but also politicians, companies need a long-term outlook. They don't have that in many cases to implement, on the one hand, the far more ambitious NDCs, but on the other hand, to develop the required technologies and also to raise the necessary funds. But we not only call for making these long-term strategies mandatory, they also need to be reviewed periodically in order to account for new knowledge, to account for uncertainty that we still face about future development. Now, we need to recognize, first of all, that climate neutrality is really not more than an intermediate target on the way to climate stabilization. It requires not only for all countries to become climate neutral, but also to develop these forward-looking decarbonization pathways. That includes not to hold on to these bridge technologies that we sometimes kind of use as an excuse to not go further for too long. So avoid new technological lock-ins with respect to infrastructure and maintain really the options that we need for permanent, not just temporary, but really permanent CO2 removal. It also requires these outlook on stabilization instead of only neutrality to really design COVID stimuli program, which we are so much talking about these days, with keeping climate neutrality and climate stability in mind. And in this, of course, we need especially to support low-income countries via multilateral cooperation. And not only to help each other, but also to kind of have a holistic view on things. Not only thinking about climate change, but also about the biodiversity crisis and, for example, pandemics or global crises like COVID in an inclusive manner that leaves nobody behind. Now, for this to actually be possible, our paper looks at what we see key demands on these long-term strategies to be successful. They have to be, of course, geared towards long-term climate stabilization, and at the same time should aim for these synergies and multiple benefits with respect to the sustainability agenda that I just talked about. They always have also to be considered in an international context, taking into account the impacts on other countries and supporting development, supporting innovation on the basis of multilateral partnerships. And finally, they have to improve the planning security for agents, for households, for companies, but also for regulatory agencies through stable long-term regulation. That also assures for the provision of the necessary private and, as we have already heard, public funds. And topically, we identify 3 priorities that should be considered in these strategies, and especially stress that these 3 topics are not mutually substitutable. So they all needed by themselves and individually. So first, it's CO2 emissions from fossil fuels have to be phased out fast and completely, and their exploration and extraction has to be ended. Only where no sustainable alternatives to fossil fuels exist yet, we should use them and at the same time assure that the carbon is stored and not released later. Now, new energy systems have to be designed, or the entire economic system have to be designed systematically and not just looking at the piece by piece of these new systems, aiming always for these multiple benefits with respect to sustainable development at home, but also abroad in the spirit of solidarity. Secondly, these long-term strategies should aim to strengthen the biosphere's contribution to climate stabilization. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are among our most indispensable natural life support systems. Yet long-term climate stabilization cannot be accomplished without an intact and environmental and resilient biosphere. So we have to use strategies that yield emission reductions and at the same time preserve and foster biodiversity and ecosystem services. And that is described or expanded on in length in our last flagship report, which was labeled Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, in which we focus on 3 exemplary, really, multiple benefit strategies that foster, on the one hand, climate protection, on the other hand, biodiversity, and third, also security of food systems. Now, for these strategies to be successful and to be implemented, climate policy is, however, not enough. Of course, climate policy is the key for long-term strategies, but we always have to think at the same time about separate instruments and financing for ecosystem service protection. And that includes, as we don't have it yet, a broad system of payments for these ecosystem services. Now, finally, the third priority that we stress is really thinking ahead, and thinking ahead about, in this case, CO2 removal from the atmosphere. The technologies that are necessary, they have to be developed in order to be deployable when needed. Today, many of these technologies are not ready to be used at scale, and they have a number of side effects and they have limitations, some of which are still really poorly understood. So preparing for CO2 removal includes not only to look at the technologies themselves, to develop them further, to put them on the market, but also understanding really the systemic and broader, especially also local impacts of these technologies. And while at the same time, of course, avoiding a continuous lock-in into CO2 usage and in using CCS and storage capacities only for fossil energy. And of course, we stress that over and over again, that of course, preparing for the use of negative emissions technologies can never, full stop, replace ambitious mitigation. That limits then also the need of these CO2 removal technologies in the future. And to ensure that the incentives for mitigation are not diminished, we really need, and there's not that much talk about it yet, an international governance framework for negative emissions. And this includes that countries clearly separate between climate policy targets for emission reductions on the one hand, and those for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So those are all three topics that we think are really crucial for such long-term strategies to be successful, and always considered with these 4 points that are presented earlier in the back of the mind. And that included, among other things, cooperation on an international level. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking for the comments from you, from the experts, and to the discussion afterwards. And let me just point out, as we heard before for the charter, that you can also download this policy paper as well as our flagship reports from our website. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Pittel. I'm sorry. Thanks for your extremely enlightening presentation on how you look at the long-term strategy. And I noticed that you have emphasized its linkage with sustainable development process, financing support, and of course, the partnerships, international partnerships, which are going to be key to implementing a good long-term strategy. And you have suggested that we focus on 3 areas: emission reduction from fossil fuels, biodiversity protection and ecosystem preservation, payment for ecosystem services, and of course CO2 removal. I'll have a few questions on some of these issues maybe when we end with the presentation, but thank you in any case. And let me now hear the third presentation from Mr. Aleksander Śniegocki, who is the head of the Energy, Climate and Environment Program at WiseEuropa. He has holds a master's in economics, and he's currently working on several projects with the Polish government for transforming the economy in a sustainable manner. So obviously we will have a lot to learn from his experience of how he thinks things are developing in Poland. Over to you, Mr. Śniegocki.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Warsaw. I will also share some slides. So I think that you should see them now.
Yes, we can see that.
Perfect. So once again, it's an honor to provide inputs to today's discussion. So Just a word on the project, on climate recon project, which results I'm presenting here. So this is a collaborative effort of several European partners in actually two stages of projects. First of all, we have looked at preparation of national European strategies, long-term strategies over the last few years, and now we're looking, assessing how far have we gone and what can we do better in the coming months and years. And you can also find documentation on our project website. And then once again, the most of our work was actually connecting policymakers, modelers, analysts working on this long-term documents already during the preparation stage. And now, once most of them have already presented their work and submitted the strategies, and now looking at updating them, we're also connecting them now more online, but hopefully we will also meet much more in person over the next months and years. So to provide a bit of context, already a few years back, the European Union countries have agreed on a common framework for long-term strategies, alongside a much more detailed framework for plans up to 2030, and provided date for every country to prepare and submit their long-term strategy on European level, and then also in a global context. And then after a couple of years, we can see the progress. And here I would like to focus on WiseGuard Group. This are 4 Central European countries: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. And this is an interesting case for our discussion today, because we can see that there's a quite broad spectrum of approaches, and also in the context of European transition to climate neutrality, this part of Europe has its own sets of challenges with relatively high investment needs compared to other parts of Europe. So the first thing which we have noted is that different countries had different processes and even timelines, with Czech Republic being early mover, actually completing its strategies before the European level framework was set up. Then Slovakia submitting the strategy within the deadline for European Union member states, and adjusting its contents to fit the net zero target basically last minute. And then Hungary taking more time, but presenting also a broad, complex document which has been presented a couple of months ago. And Poland, so as has been mentioned, we were also supporting this process. It's on the final stages of preparing this document, finalizing internal government discussions, but this is also a very advanced process. So each country has its own process and timeline. And then the targets are also reflecting these different points. So both Hungary and Slovakia already declared climate neutrality. In Czech Republic, it's still this 80% target, but this is because the strategy was prepared already a few years back, and it will be updated. Another common part is that targets are set mostly for 2030, interim targets are set for 2030, with less details for long-term renewables and energy efficiency shares, and less details on 2040. What is important for our today's discussion is how socioeconomic impacts are assessed, and to what extent this strategies go actually beyond only climate goals. So we can see that the analytical part, actually in all of the documents, includes socioeconomic impacts, but it focuses mostly on investment needs, on the costs of transition on sectoral levels, but at the same time, there's little to no details on distributional impacts. So this is clearly an aspect which will need to be covered in more details in the coming years, as well as this less focus on how to assure that there is indeed a just transition across sectors and across different groups. And this is why the governance part of strategy is so important. So among the published strategies, every one includes provisions that for regular assessment and institution which governs and monitors its implementation, which is quite important, so that the document is actually adjusted over in the future to reflect this broader context which we are discussing today. And then to conclude and maybe to present a bit broader lessons from this European process, we see that there's a lot of work being done and what has been done already on the national level, and there are national capacities to develop the strategies and implement them, but at the same time, there's always room for improvements and also room for dialogue and exchanges in this context on regional level and European level, but also obviously going beyond Europe when we talk about how to design just strategies which include more than only climate aspects and also which move beyond climate neutrality. It's useful to maintain this cooperation, monitor what's going on in other countries among our partners, so that our own strategies are designed better. And we will contribute to this process on European and regional level in the future by monitoring the progress in Central Europe and different aspects of European long-term strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Śniegocki. That was an interesting point on which you concluded. You mentioned that the long-term strategies are often conservative in nature unless full financing support is assured or available to them. And that's why there is a lot of possibility of improvement in the targets in the long-term strategy. And you also mentioned briefly to the role of gas, which means alternative access to energy is equally important when you frame a long-term strategy. So these are two very important points. Thank you very much for pointing it out. I have now Ms. Marta Torres Gunfos, Professor Gunfos. She's a senior research fellow at the Climate and Energy at IDRI. You are fairly familiar with this important French institution. She has a lot of experience in the field of working on environmental projects with several government bodies and international bodies. So, Professor Gunfos, you have listened to these three presentations. How do you sum it up, and what is your what is the important point that you would like to pick up and raise an issue with any of the panelists?
Okay, thanks. And first and foremost, thank you very much for also letting us share our experience here. I definitely would agree with most of the messages on how to improve long-term strategies that have been shared. I think to try to summarize almost, I would like to understand, okay, so what does it mean now going forward, no? And what are the implications on what we could see now also at COP26? And I think that we've heard, and there is a strong call for renewing kind of this mandate for doing long-term strategies. And beyond what we could see here in the outcome of COP26, I think it is very important for me kind of understanding different things that have been said. One, that the long-term strategies, and we've done that through the DDP over more than 30 countries now with national teams, and we interviewing at everyone, all the stakeholders that have been engaged in those processes. They all confirm that there is value in the process. So the process of developing the long-term strategy always matters more, even more, no, than the final document, than the final roadmap. And why it matters, and most of the responses always are because of the capacity that is being generated at country level to understand the complexity, no, of what does it mean, no, transforming and achieving the long-term Paris goals, all of them. Coordination, helping the coordination, and helping anticipating potential conflicts, potential trade-offs, and that's why it's so very much it's about, a long-term strategy about indeed development pathways, because it's really that longer-term perspective that allows to explore further and to see the systemic, no, transformations and how they link with other non-climate objectives, and therefore a very important tool for countries to explore, no, how to meet both climate and non-climate objectives. And having said that, what you were saying, that even if it delivers domestic benefits, very importantly, they do require support, and they do require international support to develop them, because they are resource intensive, and basically because they are, they're just so important. And really, I think I think what we saw through the MDB statement, right, that they're also thinking about helping this, because it's a key point. So support, it is really necessary within this mandate to make sure that the countries continue having, also the possibilities to continue. And exactly as also you were saying, and I think all the speakers, right, if we do long-term strategies, it's not just to understand the long term, is to inform the short term. And here I think two very important things that we see. One is that the more granular it is, the more sectoral lenses that can be applied, the easier that is then to talk to the sectoral ecosystem, the sectoral stakeholders, and the easier that is then to discuss policies and to move into action. So that is one thing. Second, that they've been very important in identifying what are these international cooperation specific things that may be needed, because by doing these exercises, exploring, what it means transforming the economies, everyone realizes how much you need from other countries. So what are those boundary conditions? What others need to do so that I can accelerate my domestic transition? So if we look now at the global stocktake in 2 years, we think that it's a very important tool that countries have at their availability to identify those cooperation needs in a very specific manner, to make sure that we can have then a global stocktake around cooperation and learning, and identifying what are those leverages and that are needed then to inform the next round of NDCs. I would leave it here for now. Thanks.
You made two very important points. One, that the process itself is very important. The process of formulating a strategy gives rise to many of the questions which need to be resolved. To be able to understand what exactly is the objective and how should it be done, what are the complexities in this. So that's equally important. And second is about, apart from the domestic benefits, I mean, every strategy needs to have some benefits for the domestic stakeholders. But the role of international support is extremely important in advancing that strategy. So thank you very much, and I'll come back to some of the panelists with a few questions here. But I see perhaps Mr. Sanghi now on the screen. Dr. Eclabya Sharma. Sorry, Dr. Eclabya Sharma is here, but I'll come back to you towards the end of the discussions for your remarks. Dr. Pittel, I had a question for you. You mentioned about the three issues that need to be addressed in a strategy for the long term. Of course, everyone talks about the fossil fuel emission reduction. That is implicit in any long-term strategy. But you also emphasize the role of CO2 removals. But I didn't hear anything very specific about role of technology in reducing the emissions. Is it necessary that we cannot do without CO2 removals through carbon capture, or we can think about some solutions like green technology so that the emissions by themselves come down and we don't have to go down that route at all?
I mean, we don't go into explicit detail on which technology should be used or should not be used, but we basically look at the emission development as we see it and at the IPCC reports as we know them. And the IPCC basically stresses that in any case, you will need, in order to reach the 1.5 degree in the long term, negative emissions after 2050. So then the question is, of course, like you said, can we do that with basically nature-based solutions, reforestation, and so on, or do we need technologies? And the answer is, we don't know. I mean, it could be that if we really succeed at this COP or in the future next years, that we reduce emissions really fast, then we don't need that much negative emissions. But if we don't, then we might actually need them. And so the point of the paper is really to say, be prepared. There is a limit to what you can do with nature-based solutions. And after that, you might have to turn to, for example, whatever you can store under the earth, either getting it out of the air or, for example, capturing whatever you burn when you have bioenergy, so BECCS or ducks or something like that. And you can't do that basically from one day to the other. So you have to have the necessary technologies in place. You have to understand where to do it, what the consequences are, how the mix should look like. If you just concentrate on one technology, likelihood is that you actually generate much more severe repercussions, for example, in the local, in the vicinity or wherever, on communities, on indigenous communities, depending on where the storage is, than if you have a mix. And so the paper emphasizes the point, be prepared. We don't say, like, we want these technologies necessarily to be used, but we acknowledge that it might actually be necessary.
All right, thank you very much. I do appreciate this point, but you know, the nature-based solutions, I have always felt that they serve both purposes. They serve they are one of the few instruments which serve the ends of mitigation as well as adaptation. So nature-based solutions have a very large role in protecting the biodiversity conservation to which you have referred to.
Absolutely.
In addition to promoting livelihoods. So they need to be promoted, even if their impact on emission reduction may not be that much in the long term. So that was one point I wanted to make.
I agree. I mean, nature-based solutions should be addressed first because they have these multiple benefits if done right. I mean, of course, you can also have, for example, reforestations in different types of manners, more CO2 captured, less CO2 captured, depends on what you do with the forests, for example, afterwards, to just burn them or use them for buildings. And so, I mean, there are multiple benefits with respect to biodiversity, with respect to economics, with respect to carbon capture or the negative emissions to be reaped from these solutions. So we always advocate to do that first. But we also say, be aware of what else you might need.
Thank you very much. Let me now go back to Shali, who was the first presenter, and she began with the most important statement that the equitable, the equity is the basis of sustainable actions in the long term. And if we really want to achieve climate stabilization, which is going to be sustainable, then it has to be equitable. So what are the formulations for equity which you have in mind, which can be implemented within the the global discourse at the moment? Of course, Secretary did point about the CBDR as the fundamental principle. So that, of course, remains there. But in the context of long-term strategy, where all countries are expected to contribute, now each one has come out with a net zero goal by a certain time frame, how do you think equity can be anchored there?
Thank you so much, Mr. Rashmi. So yes, we did look at some of the existing formulations of equity in the charter, and there are like various type of proposals and framework out there. But what we feel is for long-term strategies and to considering that it considers equity, duly, it just does not need, it should not just focus on mitigation. It needs to focus on adaptation along with climate finance as well as technology transfer. But also to kind of just also just flag the issue that at the moment adaptation, especially like the way mitigation is being tracked, adaptation is not so much tracked. So that aspect needs to be tracked better. And even if we look at like the adaptation gap report by UNEP, the climate finance needed for adaptation is very it doesn't, it's not even 50% of the share. And I think this needs to change. Adaptation needs to get a higher priority in terms of climate finance, because these are mostly coming from public finance sources. In terms of mitigation, a lot, with a little bit of public finance, a lot can be mobilized from the private sector. This is not the case with adaptation. So I think for long-term responses, it needs to be broken down. When it comes to even in terms of climate finance, it needs to be broken down into adaptation climate finance, into mitigation climate finance. And then I think that will be a good way, along with measuring mitigation, adaptation. For example, the long-term strategies, if you look at the ones that are communicated and available on UNFCCC website, for example, a country like Mexico has more country that it will cover 80% of its geographical area under adaptation measures. So it has some kind of quantifiable mention in terms of adaptation. So at a global level also, and this was mentioned very briefly in the G20 outcome document, that India, I mean, and that communication related to adaptation, the national communication related to adaptation, would need to be strengthened. So let's hope that if we go in that direction, any equity framework should consider all these aspects, and climate finance needs to be broken down into adaptation climate finance as well as mitigation climate finance. Thank you.
Okay, so adaptation and adaptation finance is the key to equitable actions in the long term. And thank you for clarifying that. I'll go back to Mr. To Aleksander Śniegocki. He was talking about the long-term strategies by the member states within the European Union. So I would like to once again ask him, do you think there are any constraints which operate at either at the European Union level in developing most ambitious long-term strategies, or how do the member states look at this whole process? How do they align their goals with the goals of the European Union?
Thank you very much. So I think that it also depends on the member states. So some of the member states have their own processes, their own national process, which they just adjust a bit to fit the general European level framework. And for some of them, especially it's quite often in Central Europe, then we have European level frameworks which are significant benchmarks, or just starting the process on the national level, when basically the government has to come up with a strategic document to meet the common regulatory framework. And this has happened with the strategies, and this has happened with also plans for 2030. And I think that once again, to come back to this issue of process and learning by delivering the strategies, it's quite important that you also adjust the capacities, because in many cases the governments, when they focus on short-term, mid-term planning, they don't have capacity to focus on developing complex long-term strategies. And when they have to, and they face this challenge over a few years, they see that they have to invest in capacity, they have to start this discussion with experts. And that brings us to a completely different point in the national discussions. When today we talk in Poland, for instance, on how we want to manage the transition to climate neutrality, we're in a completely different point than we were 2, 3, 4 years ago, because at least now we know what are general pathways to that, what are sectoral challenges, and now we can start discussing how to manage them appropriately, and we can ask, okay, what lies beyond? So I think that this really comes back to the issues related to capacities, to time, to learning by strategizing, and actually understanding what you have to start doing, to learn by doing, to implement the targets on time. So that's from my side.
Thank you very much. I think you are a little modest. I'm sure there is much more to the capacity. Capacity is extremely important for all the member states, and so with the large number of developing countries. But in addition to capacity, I mean, you also need certain quantum of resources to be able to drive this agenda. But thank you for pointing it out. Dr. Gunfos, you represent a very important think tank, and your country was the architect of the Paris Agreement. So how do you think, Dr. Pittel was also mentioning about international partnerships. Do you think in the context of promoting long-term strategies, so many countries have come up with long-term strategies, what kind of, the framework we can establish for international cooperation on this nature? Even in the context of short-term goals for 2030, we are still struggling, struggling to create the appropriate frameworks for cooperation. We don't have financing, we don't have technology initiatives. How do you think, taking Dr. Pittel's point, what kind of framework we can establish for the long term?
Thank you, Mr. Rajmi. It's a difficult question. I think that maybe going back to the motivation for this Article 4.19 in the Paris Agreement, I think that the motivation then was really like we need country-driven long-term perspective. We don't only, and why this country-driven is a bit like a way also to embed this equity, and this more kind of bottom-up approach that the Paris Agreement had. If each of the countries are not exploring fully, in the more open manner that is possible domestically with their stakeholders, what needs to happen to really undertake these huge transformations that need to be ahead, we're not going to be able to understand what are the smartest ways we can collaborate as an international community. So, and very much because what was happening is that if we would only have short-term plans, it's difficult to understand where things are heading, even for private sector. One example we have now, we see huge developments on the steel sector, for example. And there would be a number of collaborations that we can do, thinking about the value chains, etc. But that's very difficult to examine through the NDC lenses, because they are not there, those developments, because we don't have the granularity, because those are binding documents that are not heavily negotiated, that are short-term. So there is where I think that the importance and where I think this, because we really need to improve the international cooperation in a way. We need to learn much more from each other, and we need to help much more each other. We can't do it. And to do that, somehow everyone needs to unpack and open, like, well, those are the ways that I would like to follow, or those are, especially understanding, okay, that is what I could do, but if the rest of the world also is doing this, maybe I could do that or that. And that flexibility, that's what we feel that LTS could provide, and then identifying specific corporations and come into the global stocktake as a moment of learning and dealing and making deals, deals of cooperation, not just a moment of progress. And sorry, just one thing I had in mind, and that's why also I think it's important that even if there is a renewed mandate here for LTSs, that it becomes that it remains a voluntary instrument, an instrument that is guided by what countries need to do, with the timing that countries need, so that aligns to their policy cycles. Because it has to be that, that moment of looking beyond and thinking and strategizing.
Thank you very much. So what you're basically saying is that we need not look only within the NDCs, we need to look outside for possible voluntary initiatives, and whoever is willing to participate in that should also be added to the global efforts.
And both are very important, of course, but they play different roles, and this is one thing.
Thank you very much. I think we have just finished our allotted time, and I'm grateful to all the speakers and the panelists who have presented their views and shared their feedback on each other's points of view. And this is a great enlightening discussion, different viewpoints, different perspectives, and I'm sure this will strengthen the hands of all three institutions, four institutions rather, that have participated in today's event in planning their doing their thinking and helping others plan their strategy better. So thank you once again, and over to Anuradha.
Thank you, sir, for steering an excellent discussion. I would now invite Dr. Eklabya Sharma, Vice-Chancellor, TERI School of Advanced Studies, for his remarks and to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for an excellent session, wonderful session. I really enjoyed the session very much. First of all, on behalf of the four institutions and organizers, I would like to say that I think our secretary from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India, gave a key message to set the stage for this session. So it was wonderful. And Dr. Dhawan introduced the session very much. Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. And I would say Mr. Rasmi, who has actually made a very focused panel discussion and very much open and directing the discussion. So it was very good and wonderful session. I would like to thank all the presenters, especially the three strategy papers focusing on long-term strategies. They are really good papers already, and a lot of information can be put together. As we have heard also in the panel presentation, they are conversing and they are also giving some direction which can be taken at different scales, right from local, national, regional to global level. So that was quite interesting. So when we look last few years, I think COVID has given us a clear message that the world is so much of interconnected, and we should learn from that. And we cannot stall the climate action and climate agenda while the COVID is still active. So that is one thing which we suddenly have to see. And in the context of COVID also and climate agenda, we have to understand that there has to be more collaboration among research institutions. So in this session, we have heard three research institutions presenting papers. What a wonderful presentation. Then the next very important group of people which are quite important for future is higher education institutions. The skills, the national skills, the regional skills, or skills across institutions has to be developed. So it's the universities, the higher education institutions are going to be important. And all of these research and higher education institutions have to work in tandem with the governments. I think that was also coming clearly. We also have heard in the discussion that LTS can provide orientation for ambitious short-term climate policy, climate finance, even for COVID recovery, then private investments and equity measures. But I think what is more important is the international cooperation for transformation pathways. So we have to see where we want to go and what are those transformational changes that is required. So it is quite important to carve out that as we are making our strategies. See, the irony is also that LTS at the moment is focusing more on emission reductions, as we have heard, and very little for adaptation. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. And that is not equity. So unless we bring equity by bringing more finance on, see, adaptation fund, it is very meager globally. and how much you can really use that meager amount of money for real bringing adaptation. So we need to really change and change our systems of or approaches very much at global and regional level. Now, coming to the charter, which was presented by TERI today and was launched, I think I would like to say that I think all skills are very much important. And we need to define in this charter, maybe in the February summit, clearly what are the roles locally, sub-nationally, and nationally, regionally, and globally. I think that has to be very clearly charted out, and then I think also with different types of stakeholders. So that will give the real action, in my opinion. And we need to go a step a little bit inside. Now let's look into this region a few minutes. A developing country like India is immensely rich in natural
Dr. Sharma,
endowments.
I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt. We are over time. So
Yeah. So 1 minute, yeah. So in that context, I think the resources in this region are so important. So we need to have a regional cooperation and complementary action. So finally, I think South Asia in our LTS emphasis should be on resilience, especially on disasters. So this is very, very important. So let's keep that also in mind. And regional cooperation in South Asia is going to be quite important. Finally, I would like to thank all the speakers, the presenters, and then also the participants in this session. Thank you very much and wish you a good time in COP. Thank you.
much, sir. Thank you.